can form a majority. Now, as I said earlier, they may wish to do it in a rather more elegant way to make sure that everything's clear first, but it may be that Gordon Brown just says
A, which in this case it will be. She doesn't have to take it, but of course she will. If it was still messy, Hugh, but it doesn't look as if it's going to be, she could invoke the precedent of 1963 when Alec Hume emerged as Harold Macmillan's successor before Conservatives had votes for who their leader should be. And he was given 24 hours to see if he could form an administration. But I don't think that precedent will be needed. And now this is when the beauty and the choreography and the dignity of the British Constitution swings in. You see, after the frenzy, you have to distill dignity and a relative degree of serenity. And that's what the Queen is for. The Queen has been waiting to give her good housekeeping seal of approval to the deal that the parties produce that has got the greatest chance of somebody, some Prime Minister, Cameron obviously, being able to command a majority in the House of Commons, or at least command the House of Commons without an overall majority even. So the Constitution, the good old British Constitution, Hugh, has come through.
Well, let's try to match the good old Constitution with crude logistics. If this agreement takes us into the evening, would you expect that all of this constitutional package would take place tomorrow morning?
Well, it might be better if it did, if Mr Brown gave indications that he was going to call on her tomorrow morning. But quite often it's been in the evening. In 1945, when Clem Attlee went to see King George VI and was famously tongue-tied in that first audience, as indeed was the King, they stood there looking at their highly polished shoes, and finally Attlee could stand it no longer and said, "I've won the election." And the King says, "I know, I heard it on the 6 o'clock news." And they went silent again. But that was 7 o'clock. And indeed, if I remember, in 1964 it was 7 o'clock, or perhaps, no, it was earlier, in the afternoon of 64. But there are elections when it's 7 o'clock. Harold Wilson's hung Parliament. He went on the Monday. It took one less day than it's taken now, and he went in at about 7 o'clock too. So the Queen can do it in the evening. The Queen is the only one who can do it, however, you see. She is the only one who can appoint a Prime Minister. It's one of the great fixed points amidst this immensely fluid circumstance.
And it has been very fluid. And Ben, I'm just wondering, from your point of view, given that you're in the polling business and you've got a great vantage point in terms of the impact on public opinion, what's been the response to the past 5 days and the fact that it's taken, you know, quite a long, involved process since those votes were counted on election night?
Well, most people said they thought a hung Parliament would be a bad thing last week before the general election. But I think, to be honest, you know, once the dust has settled, once there is a government, they're going to then make their judgments about how effective that is. But what I would say, of course, is that it looks, if we are going to have a Liberal-Conservative alliance of some type, only a quarter, 27%, said they favoured that, about 29% wanted an alliance of Labour, and another third, 33%, wanted them all to work together. So they're going to have their work cut out to convince people about how it's going to work. And, of course, both party leaders are going to have huge jobs with their own supporters, particularly the Liberals, I would suggest.
Nick?
Well, not least when we see what the allocation of jobs is. I mean, quite soon there'll be some fascinating questions. Now, one suggestion, I don't want to put it any more than that, one suggestion, but made by somebody who's got some connections in the Tory parties. You could see something as dramatic as Ken Clarke going to the Treasury again, with Vince Cable as his deputy and George Osborne moving to the business department. Now, I've tried to get that confirmed by anybody in George Osborne's team. I haven't. It may turn out to be no more than entertaining gossip. But we are talking of some big, big decisions to be taken over jobs for very senior Liberal Democrats. The guess is that Nick Clegg might be given the title of Deputy Prime Minister, that he might be given the job of Home Secretary. We shall see. But these are big decisions that will tell us not just about people, but tell us some important things about policy priorities too. Because the message that I was having from senior Conservatives as they began these talks by conceding a great deal on domestic policy, but not much on electoral reform. They conceded rather more last night. And some Tories said to me, this is all rather useful. There's all sorts of junk that we quite like to get rid of, and we can now use the Liberal Democrats as an excuse. You may well find that inheritance tax promise, a bit pricey, caused a bit of problems. You might find that it gets dumped, and then they blame the Lib Dems if the Daily Mail get upset. And there'll be a whole series of things they'll be quite pleased to see the back of. Other things they might like to have adopted but thought they couldn't get away with their party. Much easier now.
We're going to pause for a second because, Peter, they're talking about the constitutional niceties, and clearly at the Palace they're keeping a very, very sharp focus on what is going on at Westminster. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell is at Buckingham Palace, keeping an eye on things there. And Nick, what are you picking up in terms of potential preparations?
Hugh, I think at this stage the Palace genuinely don't know what is likely to be the timescale of all of this. They are very closely plugged into it via the Queen's private secretary, who's been down in the Cabinet Office ever since Friday. But they are ready for any visitors who come. But there is no sense, I think, at the moment, whether that is likely to take place this evening or whether it will be tomorrow morning. Now, clearly the Palace will want to do this in an orderly fashion, but at the same time they will be aware of the momentum that has built up and the public expectation and the public desire, as it were, to bring this to a conclusion and to see a new Prime Minister in place. But I think that there is